This is part 2 of the State of Garrisons and Rise of Kingdoms. There was a vote on the channel, Discord, and the top vote was a part 2 for the State of Garrisons, where I cover gear, formations, pair setups, and everything else that isn't specifically who to pair with whom. So in today's video, we're going to be covering that. We'll talk about what your gear should look like, what your armament and formations are going to be, and what your most popular ones are going to be depending on your troop type, and how to set up your pair and the garrison's fill to be optimized for the best possible results. Without further ado, let's get started. First, I want to go over some disclaimers here, because as broad as the meta is and how kingdom seeds work, what is optimal or necessary for an Imperium or an A seed might not be so for a C or D seed, and you might have more flexibility. So I wanted to cover some things here. First and foremost, a garrison's goal is to be a delayer. So generally speaking, you're going to be up against a rally or a swarmers. So as long as you are exceeding whatever you're facing up against stat-wise, that is typically a good goal to reach if you're not sure. So if you are in a C or D seed kingdom where the gear is a lot lower, or you're in an earlier season, as long as you're keeping pace with those rallies, that's going to benefit you well as a good benchmark to start with. Of course, better gear, better equipment, better formations, better everything is better for your trade. But as long as you can reach that solid benchmark, it is a good way to start. Something else to consider too is KvK tech. In Season of Conquest, that's a huge player. Although with attack being one of the less significant stats overall, it's not completely game-breaking, but you could be at a significant advantage or disadvantage based on that. So just like with the gear, you want to try to match or exceed whatever you're up against. So since we're talking about the garrison meta, it only seems fair that we start with the center of that meta. And doing that, we have to talk about infantry. So first, let's talk gear. Infantry gear is some of what I would argue is the weakest set piece gear in the game. So when you look at the set pieces, there's a lot of attack, some defense, and some other options, but not really any health. So a lot of the popular choices actually involve going to the equipment and actually going to the leadership gear for some of your items, because there are a couple of leadership set pieces that are based around health. So they can make adequate replacements. So, for example, the greaves and the boots are both health, and that can give you 14% health in place of 8% defense and 12% defense. So you switch out 20% defense for 14% health. That's a good trade overall. You also get the 2 out of 4 out of 3% defense, so that's also an option. But overall, the more health you can stack, the better, which is a weak point for garrisons in the infantry, because the gear is just not very good. Some miscellaneous pieces are popular because there's a lot of attack in the overall equipment sets, so keep that in mind as well. For armaments and formations, Arch is currently dominating the infantry meta because Gorgo is a normal damage commander, so keep that in mind when you are setting up your pairs. Of course, optimizing for all damage is an excellent option. As many of the specialty inscriptions for Arch as you can get, the better your trade gets, so it's something that you need to look for. But as long as you are stacking all damage, even if you're putting Gorgo with Hera, you are getting good trades. So that's something to keep in mind as well. For pair setups, it depends on who your secondary is. If you're going Gorgo and Zenobia, your pair as the lead needs to be 100% infantry, and your fill needs to also be that. The more any non-infantry troops in your garrison will inevitably hurt your garrison's trade, because you lose out on the best infantry talent and hold the line because it needs to contain only infantry. And a 20% less damage on all damage is really, really necessary. And even at a 67% uptime, it's worth it. And you can see based on the investment rate. However, if you are going with a mixed defense with Hera, I would recommend setting up the pairing as 70% infantry and then 15% cavalry and archers. So if you have a 210,000 units, I would recommend having 30,500 archers, 30,500 cavalry, or you could just do 31,000 and 30,000, and then have the rest, which is 169,000, be infantry. This ensures that you always have 3 units to make use of Hera's final expertise to give you an additional 20% normal damage reduction. As for fill, you want to keep it as infantry as possible because the stats, but if you're using more leadership gear on the legs and the boots, you can afford to have a little bit more mixed units because of all unit health. But even then, the more infantry you have, the better the trade gets because of Gorgo. Now we're on to archers, and while it's fresh in my mind, I wanted to touch base on something I missed on the infantry part. For accessories, you still want to lean towards ring and horn for your accessories because all damage and rage are great, but there is room for both the normal damage and counterattack damage legendary accessories, and they tend to do better the more heavily you're swarmed. But I just prefer ring and horn as a good catch-all because it benefits pretty much every pair in the game. But now that we're on to archers, let's talk gear. And archers are a little more rigid. And you'll see that I actually have some miscellaneous pieces here, but that's actually not the standard. For the most part, the closest you can get to the full 6 pieces, or going for 4 with the 2 Season of Conquest items, is generally what you want to do. I've seen some people who want to replace the the archer helm here with some other options, but generally speaking, the set bonuses are just better than going for the all-unit health helm, or all-unit helm that gives you attack as well. Just even with mixed units, it's just not very good. You're just better off staying with the full set. So when you're looking at the gear, just like with infantry, your general benefit is to stay with ring and horn for the most part, because all damage helps your true damage, with the CY being the centerpiece of that meta, and more rage is also beneficial for that as well. But overall, that's the standard gear. Of course, this is probably the most rigid. Stay with the set piece if you can, and it's really pretty unforgiving if you build a miscellaneous piece because it really loses out on those set bonuses. So keep that in mind when you're building as well, that if you could stay on the set pieces, it's the best way to go. For formations, it really depends on your pairing. If you have CY involved, Circle and Testudo are your 2 most popular. I would recommend that if you're pairing him with anybody other than Hera, Circle's probably better because of the healing boosts. But I've seen people argue for Liang or YSG, which are more off-meta garrisons. You can go Wedge, and you certainly could. But you lose out on the damage from CY because he doesn't benefit from skill damage boosts. So overall, Circle is my recommendation because the healing boosts are terrific. If you're going with Hera, I actually recommend Testudo, because Testudo is the middle ground between Hollow Square and Circle, where you get a little bit of boost to healing, a little bit of boost to shield. So both pairs ultimately benefit, and the boosts you get while shielded are really, really great. So you get to double up because they're damage boosts rather than skill damage boosts. But that's generally my take on formations. Again, the more damage you can get, the more damage reduction you can get, the better when you're talking about inscriptions. And the more specialties you can get, the better. For pairing setups, you have 2 real options. If you're going full archers with Dido, YSG, or Liang, I really only recommend you going with Dido, but if you're going full archers, what you want to do is stick with 100% archers, because you get reduced damage from Dido and you get reduced damage from CY, and that matches the Hera threshold. That means your damage fill needs to be as full archer as possible as well, with next to no other marches, because then you lose out on the normal damage reduction. Alternatively, if you're going with a mixed defense with Hera, I recommend you going 70, 15, 15, just like I described in the infantry section. So 169,000 archers to 30.5 to 31 of infantry and cavalry if you have a full 210,000 units. And of course with Hera you have a little bit more wiggle room, so keep that in mind. But as close to 70, 15, 15 as possible, and you want the build to be as heavily archers as possible, because the more archers, the more they're going to benefit from CY stats. But overall, those are your 2 pairing setups that I recommend. Now, of course, we're coming down the home stretch and we're on to cavalry. Cavalry is interesting because there's a lot more flexibility because there aren't as many commanders that need to be full cavalry, with the exception of Nevsky, who isn't really a meta garrison anymore. So first, for gear, it's probably the most open in terms of miscellaneous pieces. This is the general set I use, but you can go for the wasteland pieces in these two spots if you want, with minimal losses. And it's a lot cheaper than saving up the coins and expertising. For the miscellaneous pieces, I recommend Navarre's Control and Ash of Dawn, which are both great health pieces. And of course, the health on the chest and boots. This is by far the most health heavy set, and this is pretty much the best setup you can have in terms of cavalry stats. For accessories, I do recommend Ring and Horn still, because all damage is terrific and more rage is great. And with the skill damage heavy commanders, the normal damage boosts of Vengeance and Greatest Glory don't really do anything for you. For formations, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. The most popular is Wedge, just because the skill damage of Jan and the skill damage of Eleanor. And if you pair the two of them together, that is definitely the way to go. If you are pairing with Hera, it's also probably the way to go, but I've also seen people argue quite well, I'd say. The Hollow Square is a good option in that case because the shielding boosts for Hera. But in any case, at that point you should go with what best suits you. And just like every other set, you want to optimize for damage output, then damage reductions, and then for your standard health, defense, attack. And if you can get a lot of full damage reductions, it is really beneficial, because the cavalry commander meta is a little bit further behind because the commander is the oldest amongst them. And Gorgo is just so dominant in the current meta that Eleanor is kind of a full step back, and with CY being as new as he is, he's still very fresh and strong. So if you can get a little bit of help in that way, it's terrific. Lastly, for pairing setups, you have a couple of options. If you're going Eleanor with Jan, which I think is a solid pair for full cavalry, you should have your primary pair be fully cavalry, and your reinforcements need to be as full cavalry as possible, although infantry and archers don't really hurt that pair as much as others. It's just wasted stats from your gear, so you don't get the benefit of the equipment and the armaments that are specific to cavalry. So it's not a game breaker for you, but it definitely helps the more and more cavalry you have in that garrison. For a mixed defense, I think it's one of the most flexible. With Eleanor or Jan with Hera, I recommend doing the standard 70-15-15 I've already described. And then with the mixed fill, you can actually go as mixed as you want. Of course, more cavalry is better because you're going to be using cavalry gear, but it is not the end of the world if you do have an extra march of archers or an extra march of infantry, versus if you had an infantry defense or an archer defense that was full infantry or full archers, because the overall stats aren't as dependent on being only cavalry. Lastly, I wanted to touch base on mixed garrisons. While not as great in higher seeds, it's a very popular choice, so I'll quickly go over. For gear, you want to have the leadership gear. It's going to give you the best stats, and it allows you to actually go fully mixed and just fill with what you have. So you want to have the full set if possible, but if you have a gear set that is more heavily cavalry or archers or infantry, you can run those items and then just adjust the pairing setup and the fill accordingly to get a little more benefit. But generally speaking, if you have more than 30% units that are not one specific unit type, so if you have a defense that is more than 30% not infantry, not cavalry, or not archers, it's better to have the leadership gear because it's 70% stat, but for all units. For overall formations, Hollow Square is a very popular one because Hera is as strong as he is, and it depends on who you're pairing him with. Wedge is popular for Lapu if you're going to do that as a defense. I only recommend that in lower seeds or places where you have good reinforcements, because it is very weak to Swarm, because Lapu is just not very good against Swarm. And you can run Wedge then, but Hollow Square is just a great option because Hera is really strong with Hollow Square, and Hera is really the leadership defense you're going to want to have no matter what. For pairing setup, it's actually a lot more flexible. I mentioned with gear, if you have, for example, a bunch of good cavalry gear you want to use with your leadership garrison, you can adjust the pairing to be more than a third cavalry. But generally speaking, you want to go as close to 33% of each troop type so that you have a nice even spread of loss. And in terms of fill, your teammates, if you have the full leadership set, can fill with whatever they have. Of course, if you have armaments that are stat based on a specific troop type, the more you can fill with that, the better. But it's not a hard requirement because it's more of a flexible option. And it's less intended to be a perfect trading pair and more intended to buy time and get decent trades with minimal loss of a specific troop type. But with that, we will wrap up our discussion on the State of Garrisons Part 2. This is an outline and it's a great way to get you started, but by far it's going to be impacted by your seeding, so keep that in mind. But let me know what you think. Is there a formation or a gear piece that you think is super underrated? Let me know down in the comments. Or if you want to see me cover another topic entirely, you can let me know down there or join the Discord using the link in the description. And as always, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.